Hey, welcome to the Ethics Experts. If it's your first time joining us, welcome. And if you're a returning subscriber, hey, bestie, see what happens when you subscribe to the Ethics Experts. You get a bonus greeting on every single episode. On this episode, we talked to Judy Spain. She is a professor emeritus, author of a couple of books, and she is an absolute blast. So we dive into how we can really build a program kind of coming out of the gate to have more impact and set ourselves up for success down the road. And she has some really interesting perspectives on how risk assessments can be more impactful. So let's learn.
Welcome to the Ethics Experts, where we're elevating ethics and compliance and HR to the strategic level it's supposed to be.
I'd love to maybe start talking about your book, because I think that's a very interesting topic, a very interesting angle you took with that. And then, I'd love to hear, about some risk assessment stuff, because that's something I think a lot of people that we talk to struggle with. And we can just kind of take it where it goes.
Sounds just so much fun.
Very fun. You're going to have a really fun day today. Pickleball in the morning, boom, ethics experts in the afternoon.
I don't know. What am I going to do this evening? I just should probably just call it for a day.
So what inspired you to write the book?
Okay. The first book, I presume, right?
Yes.
Okay. Really good question. I was at Eastern Kentucky University, where I was the general counsel and then the chief ethics and compliance officer. And when I started looking around for resources, I couldn't find any that were just really nitty gritty, that just were like, do this in this sequence. And so I decided I needed to write a book that said, do this in this sequence. Pretty simple. So I sat down and started writing it, and I know that you've written books, so you'll understand this. Sometimes you get up, you're in the shower and you're like, I have the best idea I've ever had in my entire life. And you jump out and you write like 3 chapters and you're great. And some weeks you may say, I can't even write one word. So it did take a little bit of time to write. And during that time period, unfortunately, my father was in the process of dying. And so I was kind of delayed. And actually, I finished the book, and that was the day he passed away. So it's kind of a bittersweet.
Oh my gosh.
No, it was a good thing. He knew I was writing it, and that was pretty cool. He was excited about that. So, but the reason I wrote the book really was because I felt like we needed to have some resource out there that people in higher education could take a book, literally sit down and say, if I knew nothing at all about compliance, and my boss came in today and said, hey, guess what? You are now the chief ethics and compliance officer for the institution. And you didn't jump out the window immediately, which is probably my first reaction. If I didn't do that, then my second reaction would be, well, where do I go? And that's why I wrote the book. And when I sent it off to people to have them review it, I said, because I sent it off to some people in the compliance field, and I said, pretend you know nothing. Then I sent it to some people who really did know nothing about the book, about compliance. And I, quite frankly, added in more to be, again, at a level where anybody can read it no matter what, and hopefully understand it. So it's actually been pretty helpful to me too, because sometimes when I talk about compliance, I start up here and I say to myself, don't do that. If they don't understand where you're coming from, you've lost them on like, hello, so I have to remember to go a little bit down, a little bit differently. So yeah, that's why I wrote it.
So when you're starting, like you said, going down a little bit differently, how do you start to talk about it in sort of like layman's terms, or just, kind of normal parlance, so people can really start to frame out? Because I think this is something that a lot of folks struggle with, and they struggle with it without even kind of knowing it. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. So really, really, really good questions. So, wow, you ask good questions. And after my brain is on pickleball for the morning, I really have to rethink what I'm going to say. So, quite frankly, what I did first was I took the federal sentencing guidelines and said, what do they really mean? And I broke them down into very, very, very small intervals. And then I said to myself, I should backtrack for just a second here. I'm a faculty member. I was a faculty member for 25 years. I'm now actually a professor emeritus. So as a faculty member, when I was teaching a class, I always started off with the premise that the person didn't understand the basics. So I started off with, if you were going to have a compliance initiative, what would it first look like? Well, the first question when you think about something like this is, who's going to do this? Who's the first person who's going to start the initiative? And so that's how I started it. I sat down and thought, if you're at a school, again, if your boss tells you, or you just think this is a great idea one day when you have nothing better to do, let's go start a compliance initiative at our institution. who would be the people you'd want to work with? Who would be that group of people? So I kind of started with that. And then I was the MBA director at the time when I first started the book. And I talked to my marketing people and they said, well, you have a great idea to have a compliance initiative. But how are you going to market it? And so they're the ones that came up with things like you have to have a name, you have to have a website, you have to have all these things. So what I focused on at the beginning and also in developing compliance programs for a couple of institutions is start at the beginning, start small, figure out who your committee is, figure out the name, the concept, the whole bit, start to market it, and then you start adding in all the other variables. So by the time that you got to, hey, we're actually going to do an assessment, hey, we're actually are going to look at, there really is a law and you really should comply with it. By that point, the people of the institution, you're not just coming at them with, hey, this is a new initiative. They've heard the words, they've had the little things. You know, we started off with like, we made sure we had a reporting line. We made sure our non-discrimination policy actually had a process. So when you put all those things in, it's pretty easy to morph into the next stage, which is let's have a compliance initiative and assess 271 federal laws that apply to a college or university.
Yeah, it's like everybody wants to just like give birth to a grown human, and you can't do that, you know?
No.
Why do you think we struggle with it? I mean, that angle to me makes the most sense. I mean, I feel like just the way I think about things, like if I'm starting a business, I need that name, I need that logo, I need that kind of identity because it all kind of comes out of that identity. And I think that's really smart. I think that angle's really smart. And I think it was really smart of this whole podcast is not going to be me complimenting you, just so you know.
Oh, darn.
Well, we'll see how it goes.
Bad.
No,
Maybe
but
we can try harder next time.
All right. Well, we'll see. We'll see how it goes. But really smart to go to the marketing folks because that helps to give you right up front that sort of outward focus because like getting that outward facade, maybe that's the wrong word, but that outward presentation gives some information to the market, so to speak, the people that you're trying to influence about who you are, what you're trying to achieve, and so forth. And that gives them a little root or a little frame that, to your point, you can morph that picture over time. I feel like a lot of folks, they really don't know where to start. And when we talk to people who are setting up a program for the first time, I mean, I've had conversations with folks that they're like, they get the sentencing guidelines or they get the 7 elements or the 10 elements, whatever they ended up Googling, and they just start kind of going down that list. And to your point, I think that's guidance. That's guidance with respect to like what the essence of this function should achieve in kind of an organization. And like kind of everything, you know, the orders, maybe not everything, the order of operations absolutely matter. You know what I'm saying? Like if you jump straight to policies without having this identity, or you jump straight to a risk assessment without having had any conversations or, you know, putting those, you know, big rocks in, I think you end up spinning your wheels and it takes a lot longer to get up to that kind of escape velocity on the J curve. Yeah.
Don't you think that's the reason we start that way up here is your boss expects some specific result within the first month or two, and they expect an assessment and a risk evaluation. And they don't understand it takes a long time to get to that point. Do you think that's what's happening?
I think that's exactly what's happening. But I think even the step before that is the lack of confidence somebody in that position has in pushing back against the baseless expectations of the boss. You know what I'm saying? Like you're in a position now where you've done this, you've written the book, you've kind of you've been to this rodeo a couple of times. When somebody a boss presents an expectation that's unrealistic, then you would probably say, well, you know, this is going to take a little bit of time. And you would have sort of the confidence to persuade that individual that their expectations need to move down the timeline or something like that. I think that confidence is something that archetypally the people in our industry kind of struggle with, because we're not the type to get out over our skis and we're not the type to kind of make baseless claims. And we're also just personality type wise, again, this is like a broad brushstroke and an average. There's a certain respect for authority, which I'm not saying we shouldn't have, but also what goes along with that respect is sort of this assumption, baseless assumption, I think, that whatever they think is correct. And many times it's not actually correct. Many times it's just a leader who just has built the muscle of like, I need to bring an intensity to everything. I need to bring a sense of urgency to everything. And my job is to just push things forward.
I now I have to compliment you, which I really hate to do, but
It's going to keep going then.
yeah, okay, we'll get it. But I actually 100% agree with you, and I think that's what happens. And I've been in situations where I've had bosses say, "Well, what do you mean you haven't done an assessment? I gave this to you a week ago." Well, yeah, no, we're not there yet, and it is hard to convince a boss to stop, think about this. I always say, you don't want to fail because it's so much more difficult to come back and regroup from a failure.
100%.
It's like when people start to do an assessment and they go, "Oh, I have to assess everything all in 1 year." And I'm like, oh my gosh, don't do that. Find an area where think you're pretty good, that you don't have a lot of issues, and assess them first. You look great, everybody's happy, it went well. And then you move to the area that's maybe not. And so by the time you get to the area that's really difficult, people are like, the other ones do. It can't be that bad.
Yeah. And also this person has proven themselves to be competent and credible and not a pain and aligned with the business and aligned with my goals and all those kinds of things. You set yourself up for success. I mean, imagine how crazy it would be to play a game of chess and say, before we sit down, before you move your first pawn or whatever, I'm just going to map out every single move I'm going to do. That would be an insane way to play chess, right? Because you're reacting to the moves that the other person's doing. And you know what I'm saying? You're putting your strategy into play in real time. It's not a set it and forget it type of a game. Neither is compliance, neither is business, neither is anything where you have to like persuade people. And so just the way you talked about that, I'd love to kind of dive into that, because there's a level of strategy in the way you talked about sort of launching a program that I don't think a lot of people are thinking about. There's multiple layers of communication, and I'm sure I'm speaking your language, but like, it's not just the words I say. There's a subconscious context. There's a subconscious sort of communication that goes along the way. And all those data points in the communique, the ones above the surface in the conscious mind, the ones below the surface in the subconscious mind, all those end up crafting the impression somebody has. And at the end of the day, like, we can't compel anybody to do anything, particularly in our role. We need this sort of voluntary participation. So that impression is so critical. And I just wonder, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Why is that concept of kind of going slow to go fast? That saying, slow is smooth and smooth is fast. Why is going slow to go fast such a difficult like axiom for us to stand on?
Well, I will say in higher education, and I'm sure you've dealt with faculty members, and think tenured faculty members. Okay, so tenured faculty members, they're tenured. I was stupid. I knew that. But they're like, I'm here. What are you going to do? Let's, kind of move on. And so I think administration gets to the point when they deal with a faculty of members, well, we know we're going to take a long time to make this decision. So I think it might be a little bit easier in higher education to go a little bit slower than in business. Because in higher ed, again, you introduce an idea, there's a committee. The committee will talk about it. The committee will plan to talk about the plan, and then plan to talk about the plan, and then plan again, and then they'll have a year later. So I think in higher ed, I had a little bit more, it's going to sound weird, flexibility to move slower than I think you do in business. Okay. So when we started the compliance initiative at my first institution, we started it because we had a major problem. We had a big issue. I mean, it was huge. And we realized that we had done as an institution a really poor job of explaining to people what was the right way to do something. So in a lot of ways, we had a good segue into a compliance initiative because we knew we had messed up something pretty badly. We knew we were not doing a good job overall explaining to people what a compliance initiative and what a reporting policy is, what all those things are associated. So we actually were able to take a step back and then say, let's move on. But when we started to move on, I will tell you, within the first month or two, all of a sudden I was getting pushed from the president and the board. Why aren't you moving faster? And my response back to them was really clear. Well, look what happened when we've done other implementations of laws and we've been a real big push and then they failed. So give me some more time. So when I say more time, they probably only gave me 6 to 8 months to kind of start it. But again, we started very, very slow, lots of communication. Oh my gosh. again, when the website came up, there's an email. President sent a letter. There's a compliance initiative. So every single thing we did, we kind of celebrated the whole big
Yeah.
thing. And for that reason, I think we were able to move it along. In contrast, I work with one institution that on day one, the president and the board said, you will assess all 271 laws that apply to a college university within 1 year. And I said, well, you'll fail with this initiative, but I can do it.
Yeah.
But it was not easy. So I think you're exactly right. I think we have this huge push. We have the people at the top do. And then the people who are actually doing the work get very frustrated because they can't do it. They're not ready to do it. They don't have the buy-in. They don't have people agreeing that it's a good idea to even start. So, yeah,
but that
I think
aspect of
right.
that aspect of it is the independent variable, the buy-in, people knowing all that stuff. And it just seems that we have trouble incorporating. I mean, you didn't. The conversation you just said that you had, it seems like you naturally incorporated it. But this like critical factor, the gas in the engine factor, it's like not part of the conversation in terms of the expectations management. And I don't understand why. I don't know if it's a confidence issue. I don't know if it's, an inability to confidently talk about, what's going to happen in the future. Just because there's so much uncertainty in starting something new, that may in this kind of a personality type, high conscientious, maybe mid to low kind of extroversion, they're not going to be making these like crazy claims about the future. But that I think ends up like declawing them in terms of like bringing in this aspect you're talking about. It's like, if someone's expectations are unrealistic, it doesn't matter how hard I'm working or how much stress I'm placing on myself. Mm-hmm. It's never going to get met. It's like, if my boss is like, I want a copse of oak trees by tomorrow, I'm like, well, I don't even have acorns yet. You know what I'm saying? Like, these are not going to turn into a group of trees by tomorrow. But that's easy. Like, that's an easy conversation because I don't know. But it's like translating that into this kind of a thing, it seems like there's no connection or something.
Don't you think, going back to a comment you made about compliance folks, first of all, a lot of compliance folks, based upon their level within the organization, are not that high up, so they don't have the ear. And then secondly, a lot of compliance folks who are, they're much more, I am not going to say rigid because I am not saying that word, but they're very much, there's a sequence here. Mm-hmm. And so the extrovert has to come out, because if they don't start talking to your facility service person, hey, what are the problems on campus? Your ADA coordinator, your HR person, wow, why are we having problems with FMLA? So they don't get out of their office. So to me, probably the most important thing I could ever tell a compliance person is get out of your office, walk around, meet people, so they don't feel like your big brother.
Yep.
And you also see things, and you'll be like, so when they tell you about a problem, you won't be like, yeah, that's no problem. You're like, oh, yeah, I saw that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it absolutely makes sense. And, it's almost like we're playing the wrong game at some level, or we're having the wrong communication at some level, because it's like, I think compliance ethics has this opportunity to be this true circulatory system in the organization, right? Mm-hmm. Crowdsourcing risk intelligence from all these different departments, providing insights back to those points of risk to really de-risk the organization, improve the bottom line, improve the culture of integrity in the organization. Like that's the potential impact that we can have. But, that is not a bunch of activities per se, right? That's not a bunch of activities. That's just like an animated organ in the body that is the company. You know what I'm saying? And so what we're really talking about is like brand building, or like impression management, or, you know what I'm saying? Like, what can this department, facility, or whatever, these different departments, what brand, like what space in their mind, what real estate in their mind do we occupy? And like, if you can get that right, then I think you're really starting to build a reputation in the organization. And like, that's, I think, kind of the game. I want my boss to go and ask the facilities guy about me, and them say, you know what, I thought this person was going to be really rigid and really, kind of big brother, and they seem to be really all about what I care about, whatever, right? Like, if you can have a whole, sprinkling of those kinds of potential, conversations out there, then I think that does so much to, transform these initiatives down the road. But to your point, I don't know why. Like if it was me, that's the first thing I'd be doing the first 90 days. I'd be having 100 conversations with folks, and I'd be focusing on them to try to understand them, understand what they're dealing with, understand what's important to them, because that's just data that I can use for further persuasion down the road, while laying a strong foundation of like a human to human connection,
Mm-hmm. But I would say that that's not the mindset of a lot of compliance
I agree.
professionals, because they're more of the mindset of, this is risk management. I have to do this. I have to do that. And I think you made the great point, making yourself the resource person that people want to come to, gets you into those conversations and gets you into that next level of, hey, I can be helpful. I can do this. But I do go back to, I've been very fortunate in my career. I've had really wonderful bosses, and I've always learned something from them, whether it was, how to conduct a meeting or how to do this or do that. But multiple bosses I had the philosophy of, again, get out of your office and walk around. And so when I took over the job as Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer, I was university attorney, and then I morphed over. I thought, that's what I need to do. And so you're right. I became less than Big Brother. I became a resource. I became somebody like, oh, she's at a meeting. Well, I bet I could ask her this question. So getting the mindset of compliance folks out of sit in your office and do an assessment of, and then the person need training, or they need to, got to get out of that mindset. But I think that's hard. Get out of that mindset. It's a personality issue. But it's also, we think of our job as compliance officers, we have to comply with the law, so we should just do this. And we don't think about, as you said, how we interact with the rest of the organization. So I think, that point that you have was really great. How do you get yourself kind of like an octopus out there in multiple places?
Yeah. And, I heard this quote recently that I've been saying it so much because I just think it's so true, that it's like action creates data. It creates information. You know what I'm saying? Like, my dad used to say, if you wait for all the lights into town to turn green before you get off the porch, you're never going to leave the house. Like, you got to just kind of get out there. You got to jump in the pool to kind of learn how to swim. And like, action creates information. And, it's this interesting sort of dichotomy, or maybe paradox, where a compliance person kind of like to a person kind of consistently is like, I'm not like those other compliance people. Compliance is not a one size fits all thing. We can't just impose this stuff on the business and blah, blah, blah. But if you're standing something up for the first time, how do you know what the business needs? How do you know what's most important until you get out there and get some information? So it's just like, how do I know, if I'm doing a sales, if I'm trying to sell you something, how could I, if you said to me, Nick, sell me this pen, I'm not going to sell you the pen because I know nothing about you. You know what I'm saying? I need some information from you do you need pens? Do you even write? Do you have hands? I need some data from you before whatever I try to do to like persuade you is going to, to increase the odds that what I say is going to actually be resonant. And I think the same thing is true. I've seen a lot of people come in and say, okay, well, this is what I need to do to like build a program, and I need to start with policies and start with training. It's like, well, do you? There might be something bigger that, there might be something better that you can put into place, like an enterprise-wide disclosure tool, so you can start getting speak up across the organization and start getting some data points and getting some anecdotes that might direct you, right? It's just a lot more of a chess match than, a game of Plinko or something,
Or pickleball.
Or
by
pickleball.
the way, I do like pens. So if you want to send me some, I do love pens.
I got a beautiful pen for you.
Oh, maybe I'll get one. I really do agree with you. You're right. You can't start unless you know. Now, I had an advantage when the first time I did a compliance initiative, because I've been at the institution. So I knew a lot of the issues. I knew sort of where we were. But in working with other institutions, you're right. Series of meetings, what are the issues? Why did this occur? Did you have an audit finding that you're worried about? Did you have a major problem with your vendors? Where do you start? And again, you want to start in those places to help them out, again, to make the initiative look good. And then you can kind of backtrack. But I still go back to, if you don't get out of your office and walk around, you're just not going to know. But that takes a lot of courage.
Yeah.
For somebody to just walk up and say hi. So I'll tell you a little story about walking up to say hi. I walked up to a facility service manager and I said, we had a good conversation. I said, so, what are you most concerned about? Well, he got up and shut the door. And I thought, oh boy, this is
Here we
bad.
go.
Nobody just shut the door. And I'm like, oh. So I was like, I was kind of nervous. And I said, well, what's the issue? And he said, well, all those doors, you hit the button and the door opens up, handicap accessible doors. He said, we put them in years ago and they're failing and there's no money in the budget to replace them. And I said, oh, okay. So this was his biggest concern. And had I not talked to him, I would never in a million years have thought failing ADA accessible doors was one of his biggest concerns on the campus.
But there's also information in how he shut the door. There's information in that,
Exactly. And what was neat about that whole conversation too led me to really rethink, all right, when we start talking about these issues, we have to start talking about these issues in reference to budget cycles. So making sure part of my conversation was, all right, when is this going to get into the budget? And we've missed the budget cycle. And so what's the plan? So it was really helpful to me to kind of reestablish a new timeline in my mind about when I needed to have these bigger conversations about what's the big issues that you have that you might need money for, something like that. So that was kind of a big change moment in my life as well.
Well, a total light bulb moment as well, I'm sure. And I'm sure it was very surprising that he brought that up as his biggest issue. I'm sure you had some sort of vague idea of like the type of issue you thought he would bring up. And it sounds like this was so far afield from that like assumption, which again is a great reminder that like whatever stereotypes we have, which we all inevitably have for everything, they're not necessarily right. And if you can double click on that stereotype, for example, and get, excuse me, and get some actual data, then it might be an eye-opening thing,
Right. And it was ironic because at that point I had just had major knee surgery and I was in and out of a wheelchair. And when he said that, I thought, oh, you know what? He's right. I couldn't get into that door the other day.
Good point.
And I was like, yeah, but you're right. I mean, it's one of those things I would never have thought of had I not had the conversation with him. And then it was so helpful. He became a real strong ally because he was like, you know what? She is a resource. She understands what the issue is. She can help me figure this out. Because part of his issue was he couldn't figure out how to bring this up to make it seem important to anybody else. And so helping him frame the question, I think really established that better working relationship between the two of us.
And, you just said helping him. And that's really what a circulatory system does. It helps the body by, bringing the nutrients that it needs and removing the toxins that, shouldn't be there. And that's, what an organic kind of picture of that sort of helpful role that someone from the outside who has, the right context and the right perspective can add to somebody who's on that front line. You said something like it takes a lot of courage. And I think it might. I think it kind of probably comes down to like the frame that an individual has. And I've talked to folks about this. I do this like return on integrity coaching. And a lot of it is really it really turns into like persuasion coaching because it's about getting things unlocked. And I just think, if we can reframe that from this is a networking event, or this is something where I have to go and impress this person. That's a very sort of extroverted, self-focused kind of endeavor that is panic-inducing, I think, for somebody who is maybe less extroverted and maybe like more highly agreeable. Disagreeable people are fine to focus on themselves, and so I just think if we can reframe, it's true. If we can reframe like those interactions, those initial kind of get to know you things, from like, hey, I need, this is a job interview, after I got hired job interview, to something like, hey, how can I help? That shifts the entire focus to the other person. And that's a natural state, I think, for, the archetype here in our space, because our space, I feel like this averages, what I'm about to describe, I think it's pretty right. It's like I said, medium to low extroversion, absolutely high conscientiousness, medium to high agreeableness. That's like want to leave the world better. Medium to low, maybe medium to high, neuroticism. That's like the worry factor. I'm forgetting one, but that's what I think the type is. And I just think that type is not the type to be tap dancing on stage, but that is the type that makes the world better, that is willing to sacrifice today for a better future. And you know what I'm saying? And focus on the people around them. And I just think if we can tap into that well of, natural like being that, we ontologically have almost, then that unlocks those conversations and it makes them way less kind of like panic inducing.
I am so glad you said that. When I became the university attorney, I told my staff how you will answer the phones, which I know sounds like really nitty. I cannot believe how, dictatorial she is. But I said, after you say hello, your name is, what I want you to say next is, how may I help you? Because if you're calling into university counsel's office or you're calling into a compliance office, you're like already panicked. And to have somebody say, how may I help you? As opposed to, what do you want? Or what can I do for you?
What
Whatever.
do you need?
Yeah, this became so important. And you're right. It really did reframe the whole question. It reframed the relationship. It settled people down. They weren't panicked. They weren't, oh my gosh, Big Brother's going to whack me with the ruler or something like that. And it just really did change the thing. So getting compliance officers to think that way, I'm a resource, I'm your help, I may not be your buddy, because sometimes we have to not be the buddy, unfortunately, but to have that relationship, I agree. To me, that's an effective compliance officer.
And my friend Hema Lomax, do you know her? She's great, right? She was on our webinar yesterday, and she said, I don't want to be the office of no. I don't want to be the office of block. I want to be the office of unblock, and I just thought that's such a great reframe, because I think a properly functioning ethics and compliance function in an organization should, if it's doing its job right, it should unlock that business. It should let that business or that organization, proceed toward its like mission at a much higher velocity, because there's more alignment and there's more clarity around like where the road ends and the cliff begins or whatever. You know what I'm saying?
I hope the cliff isn't right there.
Right.
Really don't want to fall.
You don't want to fall, no. But I mean, we are kind of wandering, I heard this picture once of like, we think we go through life like walking forward, but we're actually like walking backwards through life, because anything we can remember, like anything you've seen is in the past, and anything in the future you can't see. And so at best, you're just kind of like walking blindly backwards through life. And I love that. I just think that's it's so true. Anyways, I can keep going on that. And I just think
but just as a comment, in pickleball, if you walk backwards, you tend to fall and hurt yourself.
That's
so I'm
true.
just saying, you need to go
true for
forward.
Everything. It's not true
Not
for
true
everything.
Not true in everything.
That's true.
Okay, sorry. Didn't mean to interrupt.
No, you're right. You're right. I might have to rethink the truth of this tenet. I'm not sure. But I just feel like if we can remember that and we can realize that, that should give us a lot more grace, that like, we don't know how everything's going to go. We can't play this game and engage in this game of like, meeting the vague expectations of some sort of other entity that might not have the context, you know what I'm saying, for what we're doing. And I think if we can shift from trying to like fight those phantasms to instead like solve for ourselves and get ourselves comfortable with how we can make progress, I just think that's a lot more freeing. And I think the application of our efforts end up having a lot more sort of sustainable impact.
Which goes back to our original conversation about how you start a compliance initiative and getting that buy-in, whether it's top down, bottom up, or just trying to figure out a way to get people involved and have them look at it. I mean, if you don't start there and build those relationships, when you start to do risk assessments, when you start to get in the nitty-gritty of you really need to change this policy, you really need to do this training, you won't be able to do it because you won't have the buy-in and you won't have the trust, and you'll fail. And I've seen that happen way too many times. People had great ideas, but they didn't spend the time in the bottom nitty-gritty and in the relationship building for them to get to that point. So yeah, it all goes back.
It's like you can just scatter seeds and some of those are going to grow, or you can like put them into the ground and a lot more of those are going to grow, but it takes that intentionality of actually like driving it down into the earth. In your book, you talk about kind of leadership driving compliance. And I think that's, I'm sure it's particularly true in higher ed, but I think it's also true kind of across industries. So like, if you think about that, how do you think we can do a better job of activating leaders to reinforce this compliance vibe across the organization beyond, I don't know, the basic stupid things that, everyone does that don't really move the needle?
I think that's the most difficult question ever. And not the question's not difficult, but the reality is difficult. Of course, I'm just focusing on the higher ed field. Higher ed right now is just being bombarded. The laws are changing, COVID changed everything. These small campuses that depended upon income from housing lost it for several years. So they're struggling financially. Students aren't coming. We had that moment in time where the student population going into college is now decreasing. So you have all these things happening. And then, oh, by the way, President, we really do need to worry about whether or not we're in compliance with this law or that law. And your president will look and you go, really, I need to know if I can get, excuse the expression, butts in the seat on counting day to determine what my financial aid and everything else will be. So it is really hard to get their attention. And so unfortunately, what happens a lot of time, at least in higher ed, you get their attention when there was a crisis. Yeah. Something went so wrong, so bad, such a horrible financial audit, something happens that they have no choice. Or you're lucky enough to have board members who work for corporations who've had, heaven forbid, something happen. And so then they push it into leadership. But getting buy-in by a president right now is very, very difficult. I can talk to I'm blue in the face, but unfortunately, I hate to say this, but that's the truth. The most times I can get that buy-in is when I say, it's the worst case scenario. If this happens, then this will happen to you. Well, I don't think that'll happen to you. Well, look at this school over here that it just happened to, or that school. And having presidential buy-in because of fear is not the way to sustain a compliance program. It's a way to get it started.
Yep.
But it is not the way to sustain it. And next president comes in, you got to scare them as well. And, I don't think compliance is a scare. I think compliance, again, is a resource, a help. So how do you get your president involved? Well, hopefully you get lucky that you have a president who has a moral compass, a person who understands when you're in compliance, it's better for the institution, it's better for the faculty, it's better for the students, better for the employees. But if you don't have one like that, I hate to say it, you have to go almost with the scare factor. Cannot believe I'm saying that.
Well, I don't know. I don't know if it's even bad. I just have this theory that like every lock can be picked. It has to be true. There has to be a way to persuade everybody. And so if we start with that premise, then it kind of becomes a game of like figuring out what's going to resonate. And it might be something that's fear-based. It might be something that's efficiency-based. It might be something that's ego-based. I don't know. But part of achieving that is having enough insight and data about that adversary, that person that you're trying to, persuade, so that the odds of what you say, resonating are higher. I think you're right. I think like you can't sustainably just like threaten people. Then you start kind of sounding like Chicken Little, and then that starts to lose its thing. But I'm on the other end of some of these conversations, like frequently, not just about compliance, but just other things where, someone's been put into a position and they're trying to get me, they're trying to convince me to like give money to their initiative or something. And I kind of find this, and this might be just me, I find that when I'm talking to somebody and they're trying to convince me on a certain like persuasion path that I feel the logic behind it is flawed, or the argumentation is not like right, it's like I stop there. It's like I can't get past that. And so like so some people really struggle in convincing me because like their logic just doesn't resonate with me, and they might be right, but like that stops. That just kind of stops it in its place. But then there's other folks who they seem to be a little bit more fluid, and like I almost like in retrospect after a conversation where I've probably, given them the thumbs up, I can see them kind of trying and snaking a couple of different angles. And like, if this door's shut, then they try this one. And then they try that one. And I don't know if these people are just naturally good on their feet and they're good at sort of feeling, reading the data that I'm communicating back with my face or my body language, or they've mapped out a couple of different sort of doors to try before the conversation. But I'm just saying, I think whenever we come to, a fight with one weapon, the odds of us winning are a lot lower. We have to have kind of a bag of tricks or something. I don't know. What do you think about that?
So I used to have one of my favorite bosses said to me one time, again, I've learned so much from these different bosses. Before you go into a meeting or before you go into a conversation, you need to know the motivational factor of each person in that room.
Yes. So right.
And so what was good about my boss is one boss, I knew maybe because of other conversations or kind of in general where he was going to end up on a conversation. But he went into the room, made sure every single person in that room was heard. He responded with the appropriate body language, appropriate comments. I understand what you're saying. And then he would come up with a decision. To me, that's a good leader because he listened to people. He did change his mind when when there was a good logic, when there actually was a flow of information. And people did learn to pivot. Okay, wait a minute, we're pretty sure he's going to go this way, so let's us go that way. But I think that's such a hallmark of a great leader is knowing knowing the answer, being willing to take some things differently, but then making the decision to move on. And I think compliance officers, we still think we're too low in the totem pole to do that, but we're not that low in the totem pole because we're the ones later on, they're going to say, hey, you need to think about this. So compliance officers can be leaders. They just don't think of themselves, I don't think, as much that way.
I think that's right. And, maybe it's that sort of respect for authority thing. Maybe it's, just a mindset issue. But I don't know. I just think no never means no. No means not yet, or no means you don't know enough yet or something, And but if you have that kind of a fixed mindset, or you think you're a low man that has no position, no business being in that conversation, then that extra little fuel tank that you have to tap into to be super persistent or come back again after your third no is probably going to be depleted or not even like accessible to you,
Right. Well, clearly you've never had a 2-year-old child or a grandchild say to you no, and you say yes, and they say no. And at that point you give up. You're just like, okay, I give up. But aside from grandchildren and children, with bosses, I do agree with you that, if again, what your goal is, where you need to be, where your compliance program needs to be, you understand where it should be. And it's just seeing how you can get people on board, seeing how you can, again, motivate them to all show up approximately at the same spot most of the time. And sometimes you don't.
There are these
you don't at all.
There are these two paths to drive change, I think. And one is like speaking in the conditional tense of should. We should do this. We should do this, blah, blah, blah. And then there's this other path of like co-creation. And Hema was talking about this yesterday. And I think if we are in the creation phase of something, it's way easier to get your kind of like pre-acquire your buy-in before the thing happens by bringing it to you and getting some input and so forth. And in general, I just think if our only tool is a hammer, then we're just going to be speaking in conditional and trying to push things forward because that's what we should do with no consideration for like expected value or the odds of something happening, which is how kind of everybody else in the organization thinks. And I think what that causes us to do is leave a lot of persuasion on the table, because what I love are these kind of how and what questions. I talk about this all the time, but like if I have a problem and I come to you and I say, hey, we should do this to solve my problem. That's not as like animating, right? That's now my guard is up and now I'm like, what are you trying to make me do? Versus me coming to you and saying, hey, I think we have this problem. What do you think would happen if this happened? How do you think we could fix this? Now, I'm not prescribing anything. We're co-creating that prescription together. And so now when whatever, it's kind of the example of your boss. He went around and he heard from everybody so that when his decision came out, everybody felt heard. Everybody felt like they had some contribution for it. I'm sure he sounds like the type of guy who was willing to say the why behind the what of the decision, which again is honoring to the human beings that are, voluntarily participating in whatever thing we're talking about. But those how and what questions are so powerful. but it takes a little bit of like tact, I think, and a little bit of maybe courage to go and have that how and what conversation with your adversary after you've maybe tried that sort of hammer, that sort of conditional hammer.
Again, I hate to compliment you, but I 100% agree with you. It's killing me.
It's infuriating, right?
Pretty much so. So, and I don't mean to do this, but kind of going back to the book just for a second, when I started looking at the individual chapters and started thinking about, you know, again, somebody who knows nothing at all about compliance, I mean, totally nothing about compliance, how would they start to explain to somebody why you would need to do an assessment? What do you mean? I already know the law. Well, okay. So again, what can I do to help? How can we do this together? How can this make your job easier later on down the road? And so that buy-in, those how questions, those what questions, when you start actually doing the work, makes it easier. It makes the conversation flow. It's not the, big brother or he against he, she, whatever. It's okay, let's figure this out together. And that was huge to get to that point. And that's I think when I first started doing an assessment, I wasn't there first couple of times. And I was like, well, this is not working out. So I had to really rethink, how can I do this better? Thinking about my boss's conversation, motivational factor of each person in that room. How can I do that? So it just made it easier for me.
Yeah. It just like unlocks so much. And, the process just becomes like a lot more organic or natural or something.
Yes. Very much so.
So when, I wanted to talk a little bit about risk assessments, and because, you did that course for SCCE, I think. And, I just think there's a lot of issues with risk assessments kind of today. I just think, I think sometimes they get totally overblown. I think sometimes people think of them as an end unto themselves when it's really like the start of something, you know what I'm saying? And it's like an iterative process. For some reason, this is bizarre, I've fallen into this like YouTube rabbit hole of woodworking shorts. Okay. I don't have any tools at my house. These are guys who are making tables and stuff. And it's like so fascinating to see them like create something. But obviously, when you're like sanding down a table, you're continually like changing the grit of that sandpaper, and it's getting finer and finer over time. And like the first sandpaper you're using is totally rough and blah, blah, blah. And like, there's a lot of wisdom in that, I think, because like, think of how long it would take to sand down this table that I'm trying to describe to you using like the finest grit sandpaper. That would take forever. Right. And like, if you're starting out with a risk assessment and you're like, okay, I'm going to do 200 things and I'm going to look under every single one of these rocks, it's probably going to take too long. You're probably going to run down a bunch of like rabbit trails that aren't going to lead anywhere. And it's probably not going to be that, effective. I would say go around to the leaders and say, what are the biggest risks? Cut those against what you think those biggest risks are, and start with that. I mean, taking a Pareto approach to this iterative process that is going to be refined over time seems so much smarter.
Again, I agree with you. So actually, I do agree. There's a couple ways to start a risk assessment. One is, you're right, you just pull up the list of laws and just work your through alphabetical, or, divide them up by here's HR, here's finance or whatever, and just work your way through. Or the other way is to go and talk to a person and say, what are your biggest risks? The problem, however, with that scenario is sometimes they don't know what they don't know.
Sure.
And so they don't know that, wow, I should have done this report, or I should have done that, or I should have done that. So I think it needs to be a combination of the two.
Agree.
I think there needs to be some structure there, which also gives credibility, quite frankly, to the assessment. Otherwise, like, why'd you make up that law? Well, I just thought it looked interesting. Yeah. I thought I would see how you did with it. But then I think the first time you do an assessment, I think you're so right. We try to go from, we've never done it, to the nitty gritty. Like, again, is every single walkway on outside of your building handicap accessible, as opposed to, do you have an overarching policy when you have a visitor on your campus, or at your building, of whether they can get in? So I think when you start to do an assessment, at least for the first go around, you need to do it still pretty high level. And then what you do is then you empower the people who are in those areas to say, now you take this, you start developing the policies and procedures, you look at the budget and you say, we need to have curb cuts. We need to have more handicap parking, or we really need policy. We really need to buy software to determine what 12 weeks leave are in Family Medical Leave Act, as opposed to putting it on somebody's calendar who counts the date. Because that would
Right.
clearly be an easier way of doing it. I'm joking, of course. So I think when you start off, you have to combine the two, the list and the conversations. But then when you start to do the first assessment, do it broad. Do it very, very broad. Get what you're thinking about, get people involved. And then you have to go into this with the attitude of, if somebody says to you, yeah, I know I'm supposed to be the person at this company that knows the most about this law, but I don't. If we discipline them from the beginning, we've lost them, we've lost the process, we've done nothing to help ourselves. So we need to say, okay, let's make sure that you do. Let's make sure you get to the training. Let's make sure you get this. So having that support structure. But if you start with, again, oh, we need to have a law that says there's only 12 weeks off of Family Medical Leave Act, and we have to dot this form or that form. You're in the weeds. You've screwed up from the beginning. So yeah. Big picture. Yeah.
I mean, think about if you're taking, maybe I'm still in wood shop mode here, but like if I'm trying to transform a woodworking shop into a hermetically sealed room that I can make like silicon, computer chips in, I'm going to need more than a broom. You know what I'm saying? Like, and it's not going to be done in a day. There's a lot of stuff that has to happen. And so for us to go from like nothing in place to a fully functioning, fully actualized compliance program, that's going to take a lot of time. And that's okay. That's a natural thing. And I think if we can recognize that this ideal of perfection that we continue to strive toward is noble in itself, right? The pursuit of that is noble, even though we know in our hearts that that perfection is never going to be achieved, then that should give us some grace to do the things that are actually going to move the needle down the road, not turn this wood shop into, a hospital overnight. You know what I mean?
They do. And I think that's really a good way of looking at it. And it's also a good way of putting it in people's minds. So we've done this assessment this year. You know what? We're going to do it again next year. We're going to get deeper. And then we're going to do it again in the third year and the fourth year. And then my big thing is making sure that the person who's in charge of a particular area of risk assessment is actually put into their job description for a couple reasons. One is if they have an evaluation, which they should have, and they're doing this work, their boss needs to know they're doing it. They need to get credit from their evaluation. Mm-hmm. If the person leaves, we need to know that somebody in this company knows what it is. But it empowers them to feel like I'm in charge of this area. They value me and they value what I'm doing. And if you don't have a part of the job description, you don't want it inbred with your supervisor and the subordinate, it's like, well, then it's just one more task for me to do. Nobody cares. I'll just check a box.
That's right. That's right. And it's not a false trust. It's not like, oh, they trust me to be in charge. It's like, no, you have to be in charge if this is going to actually work. Like we need your actual engagement if this is going to actually happen, Exactly.
And I think that's hard too, because individuals who you're empowering are not at that high level. They're at the second level, or even the third level away from the boss. And all of a sudden they're like, what do you mean? Like, I'm in charge of that. And I think that's kind of scary and risky for them.
Yeah, it is. But it's like, we just can't do our job without that second, third level down kind of participation, because those are the boots on the ground. Those are the people kind of touching the reality and moving things around, Yeah, it's not easy, man, but this is such a fun game. I just think it's such an interesting game. I mean, you said it in the first the first part of our conversation. The first thing you did is you went and talked to the marketing folks, and it's like, yeah, you have to have marketing in there. Yeah, you have to have data analytics in there. Yeah, you have to have ops in there and strategy, and like that's what it takes. Again, but it kind of makes sense, which is why I like that circulatory system, because that circulatory system has to touch every organ. And all those organs have a different purpose. And all those organs, they need some of the same things, but they're also very, very, very different. Yet that sort of common denominator is this circulatory thing,
I agree. And when it works, it's great.
Yeah.
And when it doesn't, It is so obvious. And even publicly humiliating too. So, you try to avoid having those public humiliation issues,
Yeah.
which is why you start small and then you build to avoid. And as I have learned over the years, embarrassing your president is the best way to shut down a program.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I bet there's a couple
Yeah.
stories in there, isn't there?
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. Your president doesn't want to look bad in front of your board, which goes back to that question about leadership earlier. Sometimes leaders don't want to disclose that there are problems in areas. And when you have a compliance program, we want to tell everybody about what the problems are because we want to fix them, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which I will tell you is hard for me as the attorney. When I was the attorney, I'm like, oh, no one should know what our problems are.
Yeah. Bury
Now I
it.
turn to the compliance officer. Oh, I think everybody should know what our problems are and let's solve them. And, my president at that point was like, did you just like change your
Yeah, who
mindset?
are
I'm
you?
like, yeah, I did, didn't I? But that's hard for a president too. It's hard for anybody in a position of authority and public relations facing to say, yeah, we did have a problem. We need to fix this. That's hard.
Yeah, it is hard, but it also makes it important, I think, for that person in that position to make sure the president or whoever's in authority knows that you have their back. You're trying to integrate, you're not apart from the business, you're a part of the business. And part of that at some level is trying to make him look good, not maybe hiding things, but you don't want him in a jumpsuit,
No,
per se,
you don't.
necessarily. Maybe you might, I don't know.
Well, no
Depends.
comment. Yeah, I got nothing on that one. So, but I do agree with you. It's, sometimes we want problems to be shown because what it's showing is that the company or the institution is making changes to do something better. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. That's sometimes a very good thing, but you just have to temper that with the optics. And I think, again, that's why I think a lot of times compliance officers get sideways with leadership because they want to disclose more and leadership doesn't. And I think that's a dance that both parties have to do.
It is a dance. And I mean, at the end of the day, you can't sort of quantify someone's like risk tolerance. You can sort of vaguely tell if someone is more risk tolerant than somebody else. And like you said, it's a dance, it's a compromise. It's like we live in the gray. So it's not easy, So Judy, this was so fun. I'd love to add your book to the Ethico library. We give away books constantly at conferences and stuff like that. So tell us though where people can find you, where they can connect with you if they want to learn some more.
So two of my books, the higher education compliance, and then the one that's dealing with governing boards, both of them are on Amazon. My other book, which is Risk Assessment 101, is actually available on the SCCE website. They commissioned me to write the book. So I'm on LinkedIn. I work presently, my main client is in Georgia. So, but you can always get a hold of me through LinkedIn, or you can send up a smoke signal or something like that. Or you can come over to the pickleball court and you will find me there with a big hat on. So you may not recognize me, but I probably will recognize me on the pickleball court.
Just yell risk assessment at a pickleball and see who looks over at a pickleball court. That's probably you.
Yeah, not thinking that's, we have a really great physical therapy place nearby that has said pickleball is keeping them in business. So I'm not going to do anything on a pickleball court that would make anybody fall.
Okay, very good. Very good. Well, Judy, thank you so much for joining us on the Ethics Experts, and we'll see you next time.